Hello, my name is Damien Miller. I'm the Head of Strategic Communications at the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. I'm also a member of the Gangalu people of Central Queensland and delighted to welcome you to the first in our new series of AusTalks. It's AusTalks Indigenous Voices.
Hello, Arthur Sinodinos here, Australia's Ambassador to the United States. I want to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. Here in Washington, DC, I'm on the land of the Piscataway and Nacotchtan people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Each July, Australia celebrates NAIDOC Week, which has its origins in the Aboriginal civil rights movement that began in Sydney in the 1930s. I'm delighted to say that since those humble beginnings, NAIDOC has grown into a national celebration of Australia's diverse Indigenous peoples, cultures and stories. And Australia's embassies, high commissions and consulates around the world will also celebrate NAIDOC in a myriad of ways. But this NAIDOC week in Washington, we're launching a new virtual speaker series called AusTalks, Indigenous Voices. For many years, the Embassy has hosted an event that we've called AusTalks, in which we invite prominent Australians and Americans to share their reflections on aspects of the Australia-US relationship and their own leadership and personal journeys. In the past 12 months, we've been fascinated to hear from the former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, from the former President of the World Bank and US Trade Rep Bob Zoellick, from former US National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, and former Australian Senator and now UN expert Natasha Stott-Despoja, to name a few. We'll continue to feature prominent Australian and American thought leaders, but we also want to introduce diverse voices and perspectives. Indigenous Voices will provide a platform for Indigenous men and women from different parts of Australia and the US to share their stories with a broad audience. For our first talk, I'm honoured to welcome Tanya Denning-Orman, a Birri and Guugu Yimidhirr woman from Central and North Queensland. She is the Australian Special Broadcasting Service's first Director of Indigenous Content and concurrently the CEO of the National Indigenous Television Network. Tanya will be speaking with Damien Miller, the Minister, Counsellor for Strategic Communications at the Embassy here in Washington, a Gangalu man whose people are from Central Queensland. I want to extend a big thanks to Tanya for her time and for kicking off our very first talk in our Indigenous Voices series. I also would like to thank all of you, our audience, for tuning into stories from the rich tapestry that is modern Australia. Stay tuned to Embassy social channels and website for more information and the future schedule of AusTalks. I hope you enjoy the talk and happy NAIDOC Week.
So thank you very much, Ambassador, for the warm welcome and to acknowledge that it's NAIDOC Week. Celebrated in Australia this week. We're celebrating it here in the United States. And we've developed a new initiative for this NAIDOC Week, and will go on as a permanent program of our public diplomacy effort here in the US. We're starting something called AusTalks, Indigenous Voices. We've had the AusTalks program for a number of years, but we've decided to expand it out to include Indigenous Australian voices, but also Indigenous voices from the United States as well. And it's really a chance to hear Indigenous perspectives and stories and issues, the leadership journeys of many Indigenous Australians and Americans. And I'm absolutely delighted that our first guest is Tanya Denning-Orman, who is the Head of Indigenous Content at the Special Broadcasting Service, which is a public television network in Australia. So Tanya, thank you very much for being part of our first program.
Ura wanrada nayukadil, as you said, Tanya Orman, Nayajunjul Kuka Yamajun Berry Gava, and it is an absolute pleasure to be a part of this. I'd like to also pay my respects to elders and custodians of the lands across Australia, all the different First Nations we have, but also pay my respect to those on lands where you're coming from, Damien, and who else is zooming in, noting that this land in Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Thank you, Tanya. That's fantastic. I thought I'd give everyone a little bit of an introduction about you, and then it'd be great if you could tell us a bit of your story as well. So just so that everyone knows, Tanya, as she mentioned, is a proud Birri and Guugu Yimidhirr woman from Central and North Queensland. She has led national Indigenous television in Australia since it joined SBS in 2012, and more recently became SBS's first Director of Indigenous Content. She's been a real trailblazer in the Indigenous broadcasting space in Australia, but also around the world, and has been very active in many media organisations, including the World Indigenous Television Broadcast Network. But Tanya, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your own journey as a journalist with the ABC and SBS, and now running such an important station in Australia, NITV, and also being the key voice on Indigenous issues in SBS?
Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned, I was Guugu Yimidhirr and Birri Gubba. That means that my family are from far north Queensland, around Cooktown in the Cape, eat very much East Coast, and also Birri Gubba is around the Whitsundays. I actually grew up on the lands near where your mob are from, the Gangalu in central Queensland. And the reason I ended up there, and the reason I want to tell that part of my story, is I guess it's inspired me on my journey. So, it's always that first steps that you have to take. So as a Murray kid growing up in central Queensland, I ended up there because my mother and her family were put into different missions around Queensland. So my nana was taken from around her community at the age of 10 over to Palm Island, which is another mission, and then down to Warrabinda, which is in the Gangalu area, in that sort of nations part there, and met my dad, who was in fact, he came over what we called in Australia 10-pound pom. He fell helplessly in love with my mother, a beautiful black woman, and he worked on the railway, and that's how we ended up in this mining town called Blackwater. And as an 80s kid, I saw the power of that box in the room. Back then, you switched on the news, the evening news, or you had the radio source, or you had the newspaper. And my dad was very much we always had the wireless on, and I could see the influence of media as a young kid, but I didn't quite understand it. And, growing up in a place where I didn't see any Aboriginal women in any sort of professional areas other than at home or, working and cleaning. One day I saw a beautiful black woman reading the news. Her name's Robina Colby. And, I thought, wow, if she could do it, possibly I could. So I guess I got that first taste of the power of seeing what you potentially could be. And that gave me that little bit of hope to think I could leave my small town. But also, back then I saw the influence of the media, and some of this way they were telling their stories were really actually, the negative portrayal, the constant negative portrayal. So I could understand in a way why people around me had that perception. So that triggered me to try and become a journalist. And I kept on knocking on the door of the ABC. I did my degree first in Rockhampton, which was the biggest regional town closest to where I was growing up. And, it just, seeing the potential, and I don't know, something from within really sort of motivated me, because in those days it was such a big thing to leave your home. And, but I guess it was that family around me, and also the fact that there was so much that we wanted to change in this country. And I had that sort of burning passion within me, and, eventually got into the ABC as a cadet. I was early 20s, and, becoming a journalist for the ABC was that life ambition, and got to travel around Australia and, report on all issues within Australia. And I was able to become a part of the, we lobbied and we got this thing called National Indigenous Television back in 2007. So I was asked to be a part of its initial setup, and I was a commissioning editor then. I'd set up my own production company, and it was, we weren't sure how far it would go. It only had funding for 4 years, and we also didn't have access into Australian homes. So the government said, oh, here's a potential something. There were Indigenous radio stations. As I mentioned, we come off the back of decades of us trying to get access, and we've had community radio, we've had community TV, but we never had everything that we could to get into not only Indigenous homes, but all Australian homes. We're only 3% of the population, and it was, in a commercial television world dictated by ratings. You know, it was just sort of seeing it wasn't a viable option. So, you know what, they gave us an inch and we've taken it a mile. And, you know, 14 years later, you know, we're reaching more than 2 million Australians, you know, thinking our population's only around 600,000. We're making major impacts, I believe. You see the changing face of Australian media now. We've got Indigenous presenters on breakfast TV. We have Indigenous correspondents all over the world. You know, we still, you know, some of the biggest rating and most successful programs in Australia are Indigenous. And when I say Indigenous, they're Indigenous made and our perspective. So, you know, I know I'm long-winded, Damien, don't ask me one little question, I could keep talking. So that's a little snapshot of what's driven me and a bit of the landscape. And as you mentioned, also the World Indigenous Network. We exist in an ecosystem in Australia of incredible Indigenous media partners, because we are different nations. So, you know, it's just beautiful to be able to connect and interchange, but also it's so critical at this point. People are looking for Indigenous knowledge, particularly in a world of climate crisis. They're looking for answers, and finally they're sort of seeing what we can offer, what we've always known. And, you know, importantly though, there's still a lot of issues and there's still a lot more in the human rights space that we need to push and need to make the change. And that's the importance of media and why I'm in the gig that I'm in.
Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of NITV's journey, where it's at right now, and what's really important for you and the future vision that you have for the station? I've got a clip just telling everyone a little bit about NITV's journey.
NITV evolved out of years of struggle
to find a platform that reflected our lives and our voices.
And as the world changed, technology changed.
The media changed.
NITV launched with a combination of hope and pride.
It's NITV!
People asked, what's on the black box?
This is a new day.
And we answered with sport,
News,
entertainment, more sport, and a lot of First Nation programming from around the world. We shacked up with our multicultural neighbours and launched our channel on free to air.
as our TV voice expanded and evolved,
our online presence exploded. Once again, we have responded with a new vision, a new horizon, a new proud identity to reflect our multi-nation,
multilingual,
multi-deadly,
multi-talented
people and communities.
Put a logo there or here. While the stereotypes want you to believe we rarely change,
The truth is, we have witnessed more drastic change over more millennia than any other civilization on Earth.
we are a proud and strong people
Always were.
and always will be.
So, Tanya, thanks. That gives a great kind of snapshot of where NITV has been over the past decade or so. Just how critical is it at this point in time for Australia, for Indigenous Australians in particular, to be able to see themselves on the screen at night, to hear the stories that are really important to them, but told by Indigenous people, from an Indigenous perspective?
Look, as you know, it sparked me as a young girl all those years ago into the potential of what I could be. So when you're growing up in a world where you don't see yourself or you see yourself constantly excluded or constantly portrayed in a negative way, you know, how you connect and interchange with that world can really impact you. And that's been a motivator of growing the Indigenous channel. And you know, today I mentioned, you know, we've reached more than 2 million Australians. However, part of my remit as the Director of Indigenous Content across all of SBS is about how we, you know, can influence and change and I guess reconcile Australia in a way that you know, Indigenous people are calling for, but also non-Indigenous people are recognising. And for us, it's about getting that Indigenous lens, so our perspective, which is a very unique perspective to a wider Australian audience. So part of my remit is to get content across. You know, we've got 5 different platforms. We've got a youth-focused channel, SBS Viceland. We've got SBS Food, and we've also got the SBS main channel, as well as the on-demand and our socials. But uniquely, the network I'm a part of has more than, you know, about 68 different programs that we deliver in different multicultural languages, like from Arabic to Cantonese to you know, Mandarin. There's a range of different languages, and you know, the language you grow up with is the language you trust. So what's also a strategy is to get that Indigenous news, so what's happening in the world from our perspective, out into the various communities across Australia that hear that. So that's a really unique positioning of SBS. And the majority of my staff, I have about 60 staff, and up to 70% are First Nations from all over the country. So we're very diverse within, and that was really important. So every piece of content has editorial touch points and is, you know, signed off by Indigenous people. And the, you know, the future of us, you know, we'll probably talk a bit more, but you know, we've got some incredible content that's really shifting the sands in this country. And, you know, as I mentioned, we've already influenced the media. We're also, you know, calling out the media and calling out Australians, and we're correcting the wrongs.
That's just, it's so important. I mean, and as you say, there's a real crying out, I think, amongst the Australian public for more Indigenous stories, more Indigenous content. And I think there have been a number of surveys done in recent years which have shown that non-Indigenous Australians really want to connect with that Indigenous culture, ancient heritage of Australia, because it's everyone's heritage in Australia. As you beautifully put, it's about, once you're in our country, you're part of the songline, the ancient songlines that are, you know, crisscrossing our lands. And so it makes sense that many Australians, including those who've been here since the earliest days of the European settlement, to migrants who've just arrived in recent years, I think there's a deep interest and thirst for knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and NITV plays a really important role in having those stories told. And just, you were saying earlier as well that in Indigenous story, there's light, there's a lot of things to celebrate, there's wonderful achievements, and our, you know, oldest continuous culture, and our societies and communities are really rich and vibrant and got a sense of humour and fun, and there's so many great things going on. But also there's the shade, there's the difficult issues in our community, whether it's you know, incarceration of youth or domestic violence. Can you tell us a little bit about how you as a station are able to tell some of those really complex, difficult stories, but telling them from an Indigenous perspective? We might show a clip first about one of the themes that you're going to focus on in the coming year.
It's an injustice to have Australia's Aboriginal inhabitants 13 times more likely to end up in prison.
In no other community will you see somebody walking to collect their mail and being stopped by police and asked, "What are you doing?"
Monitoring black people as we walk on our land is a form of colonial violence.
Mum should have never been arrested. It was within the first hour that she had a traumatic head injury.
Why do we persist in this bizarre notion of locking people up?
Someone dies and there is no consequences.
The system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do.
It's built to fail.
Look at the evidence that shows us what works.
We have the solutions. We know what needs to be done. Let's just do it.
This is happening in our country. We have a problem. Stop looking away.
Always was, always will be. Always was, always will be. Always was, always will be. Aboriginal.
This is not about reconciliation. This is about a reckoning with the truth of our past.
Thanks, Tanya. Do you want to speak a little bit about the incarceration story, which is, you know, a real issue amongst Indigenous youth in particular? Can you explain how what role NITV can have in telling the story?
That's right. Like, it's a powerful clip. Incarceration Nation is a feature documentary that we've got premiering at Sydney Festival in a few weeks. At the end of August, we'll be broadcasting that across SBS. And, that's been one of our, darkest areas within Australia, is the fact that incarceration rates have increased and deaths in custody have increased, despite investment by Australian governments and Australians in a royal commission. In fact, the deaths, as I mentioned, have increased. So as a network, it was really important for us to, find a filmmaker, and that's an Indigenous filmmaker, Dean Gibson, from Queensland. His company's, he created that film to, to show it how it really is, and show that perspective. But what you see within it is the solutions are there, and you get that with all of our content. The answers are there. It's not just about, it's at the local level. It's, basic, it's, finding that spot where people can actually understand by being the truthful platform that we are. But we need to cut through, and we need Australians to really understand, and also have that drive to make the change that we need them to make, because it's a matter of life. So we do have those major documentaries that we deliver, that we hope can influence, that can hope just, educate and inform. And then we also have, as a multi-platform network, we provide all other content and forums and discussions. So, this really, we had this in works for quite a few years. NITV's existence was a recommendation from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, where, as I mentioned earlier, that constant, what I constantly talk about is perception, being able to see yourself positively portrayed, because that can totally amend your trajectory or change how you feel and where you want to go in life. And also, though, to correct how mainstream media was reporting on Indigenous issues, and also to just be seen and be included. So NITV is one of those success stories from the Royal Commission. And, it was something we've always wanted to do, and have the funding to be able to try and create something powerful. So I'm so proud that we're finally doing that. But it was really, it's timely. This time last year, we were in the midst of Black Lives Matter, and that really reverberated back in Australia, because even our reporting was saying that was happening over there, that was something happening in the US. And that, of course, rose our communities to say, wait a minute, Australians, this is happening in your own backyard. You don't know about that. You need to know, and you need to amend it. And, the whole concept Incarceration Nation is built on systemic change. It identifies the systemic issues from schooling, how we've been built in Australia. It identifies how we've not been included, and how everything is interconnected. When I opened this yarn, I was speaking about, I'm a part of a family and community that were removed from their language, removed from their country, and put into missions, not being able to get earn your salary, being dictated to by a mission manager, being asked if you could even get married. My parents, my grandparents had to ask the most basic of human rights, human dignity. So we're all, I'm a part of that. And, the schooling, how we've not been able to get into other systems. So Incarceration Nation captures it, but really pinpoints the fact of where we've got a matter of life and death. So it's, we've had to, I guess those connections between Australia and the US are more profound in the ideas of how we look, but also the fact that helped rise our cause here, which was really important. And it's really created a lot of change, particularly in the Australian media in the last year as well. So it did call them out, and I'm hoping that we can keep pushing in a documentary like that. Really, it will generate a lot of attention, and I'm hoping it gets seen by the right people. And it's a case of, okay, this is what we can do to move forward.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the great strengths about Australian and US society is that we're willing to discuss these issues openly and recognise that they're very complicated. They've got often historic origins, but looking deeply about what we need to do to fix these issues. And obviously in Australia, we've got the Closing the Gap program, which has been around for a long time, which is trying to address many of these issues. But as you said, one of the key things to do it to look at these issues from an Indigenous perspective and to recognise that a lot of the solutions, their Indigenous people need to be part of the solution as well. The same as with some of the issues that are taking place in the US, it's important to include all communities that are impacted by various policies and history, and to make sure that you're having open, frank discussions about these complex issues. What does kind of NAIDOC mean to you personally? I think all of us have a special connection to NAIDOC, but it's a really important week for many of us. But just for you personally, Tanya, what does it mean? How does it resonate with you?
I think this year felt the butterflies for NAIDOC Week, because even more so than last year, because we're currently in lockdown in Sydney, and there's all biggest mobile. I'm looking on social feeds and not being able to just connect. And obviously being in Indigenous media, I've been in mainstream media, but I love connecting. I love stories. I love the work that we do. And, people have said to me, why don't you go work over in, a different platform or something? And I was like, I love this space. And that's why it's been nuts. It's been crazy trying to make, NITV's core funding is what one drama series in Australia costs. And, we've built, it's been, we wanted to, when we launched, we wanted Aboriginal Big Brother, we wanted all this stuff. We wanted to have our own home and away and neighbours, but, we got little steps, we've come a long way. But I guess it's hard for me to put into words, Damien, because I think it's my most favourite week of the year. We'll say it's NAIDOC every day for us, because especially working for an Indigenous channel, but it's more than ever, part of SBS, we deliver really cool education packs out into every school in Australia. And, we've really grown and connecting with, teachers, and you hear the passion of teachers, and, people are really wanting us in a different way than, when I think about my career, I'm feeling old now, the 25 years I've been in this industry, and that little Murray kid who grew up on the other side of the railway tracks, and not, when I was in my uni course wanting to tell this story of my grandfather, and people looking at me, to the fact that it's, as I mentioned earlier, the highest, Australians want this content, the globe wants this content, and the fact that we get to really accumulate it in a NAIDOC week. And I get joy. I ring up my mum, and she's so happy because she's, connecting with different, she's now, she's an elder, and we're laughing about that. And it's just, it's really important as a connection of, to connect. But it's also, for me, I get to talk and I get to tell our story to media. I get interviewed, and I get to, sort of talk about our movement, and the fact that, we stand on the shoulders. And, it was initially a day observance committee. It was about Australia Day. And, long before it was a national public holiday, a national day. And, it was about us going, hey, Australians, there's more to your story than you realise. And, it's our week, but, it's our week is about everybody. And that's the culture, despite the heartache, despite where we've come from, despite, what has happened. We hear, we celebrate, we have our morning teas, we have our flag raising, and we just have a good time.
Beautifully said. I think you've captured it so nicely, just that Indigenous community is really about inclusion, inviting others to be part of this incredible story and this 60,000 plus year history that we've got, and sharing our amazing continent. Look, Tanya, it's just been an absolute delight talking to you. I'm so pleased that you're our first guest in our Indigenous Voices series. We're planning to talk to lots of Indigenous leaders at the grassroots level, but also leaders of organisations across Australia. But it's been fantastic. So thank you very much, sincerely, from me and the Embassy team. And we look forward to following NITV's, SBS's journey, and inviting you over to the US as well. Once, borders are reopened, we'd love you to come and continue this conversation with your US counterparts. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me.